I'm your host, Susie Selleck. Today we're in Lockland, Ohio, and I'm joined by historian and author of Lockland, Ohio, 1,000 Memories in 1 Mile. That's you, John Campbell.
I believe it is.
Yes.
Thank you. Yes.
And a good one at that. And so
Hi, Susie.
we're on Wayne Avenue, right? And we're in the Greenwood section of Lockland.
Exactly, 325 North Wayne.
And this was formerly known as the Mount Zion Baptist Church, correct?
Correct.
So what can you tell us about the structure now?
Okay. Well, let's move back where Reverend Wallace Shelton come to Cincinnati, and he was instrumental in starting a lot of churches. And this was in 1869 that he started the Second Baptist Church of Lockland. In 1871, they built here a frame structure and dedicated it as the Mount Zion Church. That stayed until 1923 when they upgraded by building this beautiful building here. It's behind us.
Yeah. John, I understand that someone very famous in history has stopped by here before. Can you talk about that?
Absolutely. In June of 1967, Lockland and the Mount Zion Church was blessed with the appearance of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
Yeah.
And he came here for the first ever Men and Women's Day, and he spoke at that, and he gave a sermon that he wrote, A Knock at Midnight. And we're going to share some of that within the sound of this production.
Very good.
Now, the first thing that we notice in this parable is that it is midnight. It is also midnight in our world today. And we are experiencing a darkness so deep that we can hardly see which way to turn. It's midnight. It's midnight in the social order. Now, the Middle East has had the headlines over the last few days, but it should not all cause us to forget that there is another war. It's a futile, bloody, costly war taking place on Asian soil. And we look over to Vietnam, and what do we see? We see the rice fields of a little Asian country being burned at will and trampled at whim. We see innocent peasants and little children being burned with napalm. Then we see the fine young men of our country dying in mounting numbers. All of this is indicative of the fact that it's midnight. The nations of the world are engaged in a bitter and tragic contest for supremacy. And you see, the real danger is that if we don't change our course in this world, all of the modern weapons of warfare will soon conspire to bring an untimely death to the human family on this globe. The late President Kennedy was right. Mankind must put an end to war. A war will put an end to mankind. In the sense of the moral order, midnight is a time when all moral values lose their distinctiveness. And so in our world today, for so many people, there's nothing absolutely right, nothing absolutely wrong. It's just a matter of what the majority of people are doing. And over again, we see this. Most people live by the philosophy, everybody is doing it, so it must be all right. It's midnight in the moral order. And you know, midnight is a time when everybody's trying to get by. And this is exactly what we have done so often. We have ended up with our ethical relativism, feeling that the only thing right is to get by. And the only thing wrong is to get caught. And so today we don't talk about the Darwinian survival of the fittest. That was a theory that came along, but for us it's a philosophy of the survival of the slickest. Nobody is concerned about obeying the 10 Commandments in so many instances. They are not important. Everybody is busy trying to obey the 11th commandment, thou shalt not get caught. According to this tragic philosophy, it's all right to lie, but just lie with a bit of finesse. It's all right to exploit and rob, but be a dignified exploiter so that when you do it, it becomes embezzlement rather than just stealing. It's all right even to hate, but dress your hate in the garments of love and make it appear that you are loving when you are actually hating. Just get by. This tragic moral laxity, this tendency to be caught up in the chains of conformity, is destroying the soul of our nation, the soul of the world, and so many individuals. We find ourselves today standing in the midst of a threefold midnight. It's midnight in the social order. It's midnight in the psychological order. It's midnight in the moral order. But as in the parable, so in our world today, the deep darkness of the midnight is interrupted by a knock. The parable talked about this man seeking 3 loaves of bread, physical bread. In our world today, men and women are in search for 3 loaves of spiritual bread. They want the bread of faith. So many people have lost faith in themselves. They've lost faith in their neighbors. They've lost faith in God. And in the midst of this faithlessness, they find themselves crying out, Lord, I believe, but help thy mine unbelief. They want the bread of faith. And then that is a quest for the bread of hope. Everybody needs this bread. Everybody wants it. When you stop hoping, you die. In the midst of this hopelessness, men and women reach out for the bread of hope. And then that is a quest for the bread of love. Everybody needs this bread. We need it in 2 ways. First, we need to learn how to love. great problem of mankind today is still that there's too much hatred around. And more than anything else, we've got to learn to love. In America, the white man must love the black man, and the black man must love the white man, because we are all tied together in a single garment of destiny. And we can't keep having riots every summer in our cities. We can't keep having all of these problems all over our nation. Our white brothers must understand that we are too poor. And the federal government has enough money to get rid of slums and poverty and get rid of these conditions that make for riots. There's no point in continuing to make up excuses. Our white brothers have got to come to see one thing. We are in America and we are here to stay, and we've got to learn how to live together. We ain't going nowhere. Now go with me a little further, if you will. You remember when that man knocked on the door? The man on the inside said in substance, "Don't bother me. I'm busy. My children are in the bed and I'm engaged in something else. Don't worry me." So that man from within left the man on the outside disappointed at the hour of his greatest need. And oh, my friends of Mount Zion, I come to you this morning having to honestly admit that the church has often left men and women disappointed at the greatest hour of need, the hour that they needed bread most. And the other danger of this kind of church is that everybody involved will become so caught up in the irrelevant that they will not be concerned about the day-to-day problems. It seems that I can hear the God of the universe saying, "Don't play with me and don't play with my people." It seems that I can hear the God of the universe speaking to the Negro church and the white church also. And he's saying, "My people are hungry. They're in need of bread. Don't play with me and don't play with them. When they come at midnight seeking bread, provide it for them. If you don't do that, I won't hear your beautiful anthem. You can preach your eloquent sermons. You can pray your powerful prayers, but I won't hear any of it because your hands are full of blood. The thing that I'm concerned about is that you will let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. And if you want to know what it is that I require of you, it's simply this: do justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with thy God. This is what I require. Mount Zion, you have the bread of life. Keep the bread fresh. Don't let it get stale because somebody is coming by here to try to find a little bread. Some young man disillusioned about life is going to come by here one day to try to get the bread of faith and the bread of hope. Keep it fresh. Some young person who has made a mistake in life and caught up in tragic guilt feelings will come by here one day. Somebody who's made a mistake, some young person who tried to drown the guilt by finding an answer elsewhere. They tried to find it in the nightclub. They didn't find it there. tried to find it in excessive drink. They didn't find it there. They tried to find it in sex promiscuity. They didn't find it there. But one day they're coming by here, wanting the bread of forgiveness, and you've got to keep it fresh enough to let them know that there is a fountain filled with blood drawn from Emmanuel's vein. Keep the bread fresh. One day some old person is coming by, someone who has been through the morning of childhood and the noon of adulthood, and now they're moving toward the evening of life. They're worried about bad health. They're worried about death. They need a little bread to tide them over. One day they're coming by. Keep the bread fresh enough to let them know. They don't have to worry about death if they love God. Keep the bread fresh enough to let them know that death is not a period which ends this great sentence of life, but a comma that punctuates it to more loftier significance. Keep the bread fresh enough to let them know that death is not a blind alley that leads the human race into a state of nothingness, but an open door that leads men into life eternal. Keep the bread fresh enough to cry out one day, I am persuaded that neither life nor death, angels nor principalities, things present nor things to come, can separate us from the love of God which is in Christ Jesus our Lord. Keep the bread fresh. We have the bread of life in the church. It is our job to keep it fresh. I'm coming on home now. I don't want to sit down for fear you may go away despondent. I've talked about midnight. Talked about darkness. But my last point is that man who knocked on the door was just trying to get enough bread to tide him over until the dawn. He knew that morning would come. And I want to leave you this morning letting you know that however dark it is now, morning will come. All right. Therefore, I'm not worried about tomorrow. There is a pendulum swinging in life, I guess. It goes between darkness and light, midnight and morning. And our slave foreparents taught us so much. Their beautiful sorrow songs, one of which you sang so beautifully this morning. They looked at the midnight surrounding their days. They knew that there was sorrow and agony and hurt all around. When they thought about midnight, they would sing, nobody knows the trouble I see. I go on back and listen to all of that verse. Sometimes I feel discouraged and feel my works in vain, but then the Holy Spirit revives my soul again. There is a balm in Gilead. And so I can sing that, and another song comes to me. I've seen the lightning flash. I've heard the thunder roll. I've felt sin breakers dashing, trying to conquer my soul, but I heard the voice of Jesus saying still to fight on. He promised never to leave me alone.
John, in the 1960s, this was the hub during the civil rights movement. Can you talk about that?
Well, it really was, or it was considered certainly a part of that hub of the Cincinnati area. Lockland here at the Mount Zion, seeing not only visits from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., again in 67, but also he was here in 1964 to officiate a funeral of the Reverend Otis Moss Jr. that was presiding here from 1961 to 75. His wife Sharon had passed, and they're good friends. And so he comes up here and he officiates the funeral. And again in 64. And then in 65, for the Men's Day function, we have Martin Luther King Sr. that comes here. And then, more famously, yet again, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in the 67 venture, the Knock at Midnight sermon, which really is beautiful and really tugs at the heart and really captured the attention of those in attendance, of which the place was utterly packed out.
Oh, yeah.
And, there's Fred Shuttlesworth, Jesse Jackson, a lot of people that were in that 1960s movement, that we hear so much of, were right here in this church behind us. And, Reverend Otis Moss, he had been the pastor here up until 75, and he moved on to Cleveland. Today, he is in the Ohio Civil Rights Hall of Fame.
Really?
And Alberta King, who was Martin Luther King Jr.'s mother, she adopted him as her own son.
Huh.
Now, figuratively speaking, maybe not on paper,
Right,
but,
right.
That's how close that Otis Moss here was with the King family.
Wow.
And they worked together. And Reverend Moss, he would occasionally go to Atlanta to the Ebenezer Baptist Church where Dr. King Sr. would preach, and he worked with him. And the whole family, the Moss family, worked together with the Kings, and it was very close. And something that I'd like to point out in Selma, Alabama, the march at the Edmund Pettus Bridge, where the marchers were met with Alabama state troopers in riot gear, didn't go over very well.
Right.
Reverend Moss had gathered here for that trip, and he marched with Dr. King that day. And all that history lies here on North Wayne Avenue, and I really, would like people to know that.
Oh, yeah.
That this building is very special, and there's an historical significance where we're standing that is just phenomenal and beautiful.
Game changers. Yeah. John, earlier today we had the pleasure of getting to be with one of the sisters who was here in 67 with Dr. King.
Absolutely.
Can you talk about that?
Well, I'm so proud of that. And Dorothy Anderson, and you're going to hear her here on the film. Mm-hmm. And just an amazing, amazing, bright woman who grew up over here. And she was a co-chair of the event in June of 67 that King preached at.
Dr. M.L. King, as a matter of fact, Dr. Martin Luther King Sr. and my mother were kids in school together in Georgia. And Mom says she remembered when Dr. King, the father, changed his name. Anyway, let me talk about his son. His son, Dr. M.L. King Jr., and the pastor of our church, the Mount Zion Baptist Church, 325 North Wayne Avenue, came to be our guest speaker for our Women's Day, which was a first that we'd ever had at our church. Reverend Otis Morris Jr. was our pastor, and he and Dr. King came up together. They were friends, good friends. So Reverend Morris could get almost anyone to come to Mount Zion, come through Mount Zion and speak. That's how our exposure came to who we are as African American people through Otis Moss. He brought it up to make us realize, even though you've come from the South and you've made it, you've gotten jobs, and you've got this, that, and the others, don't forget where you've come from. Because sometimes people get outside the bounds of who they really, really are because they want to impress. But Reverend Morris was a speaker of speakers. He was called everywhere to speak. He and Reverend Zion Baptist on Glenwood, Dr. Booth, Reverend Booth. They were good friends. And this is how SCLC and all of this stuff got started through our pastor, Otis Moss, from Troup County, Georgia. I always remember it. He elevated us to think who you are, just like the situation that's going on now. That's what's on the tape. The tape from a knock at midnight that Dr. King gave. I sat and listened to that thing, Neil. I said, that's what's going on now with the ugliness in the hearts of people. But this too shall pass in time. So Dr. King spoke. He had to get into the church. His guards took him on the side of the building, and he came up the back way towards the alleyway boulevard and came into the church. And people were outside in the street just to hear him. And that speech was so dynamic. He just built it up, because when you're young and you hear, but you don't really know what's going on, what he was talking about. But last night, when I played that tape, Dr. King, he had a way of holding you spellbound when he would talk. And that's the way it was that Sunday. When I met him in the pastor's office, that's what that picture is, the four of us. We were in Pastor Morris's office. It was Pastor Morris, his wife, Edwina, then Dr. King, Robert McAfee, and then little Dorothy on the end. That me. Anyway, it was such a joy to shake his hand. His hand was warm. His fingers were warm. And he was so graciously kind to us, to McAfee and me. Then when we left, they went out the back door at the Reverend Morris's office and came down to the lower study. And that's where he entered the church, to the pulpit, to the sanctuary. It was a day to behold. I've never seen. That was the first time Mount Zion Baptist Church has held so many people, inside, outside, on the streets, because it's a narrow street. Wayne Avenue is just to hear this man, and it was on the loudspeaker. We made history.
John, thank you again for detailing some of the historically significant locations here in Lockland, Ohio.
Thank you, Susie. It's been a pleasure.